They gave me a stool. Not a chair. A stool. The kind you find behind a counter in a hardware store. 3 legs. No back. One of them slightly shorter than the others, so the whole thing rocks when you shift your weight. They had placed it behind the curved table, not at it. Roughly 8 inches back from the edge, as if even the proximity of a human to the actual negotiating surface required a buffer zone. I sat on it. I straightened my jacket. I opened my briefing document on the tablet and pretended to read something I had already memorized, because reading it kept my face occupied, and my face, when unoccupied, tended to do things that were counterproductive in diplomatic settings. The convocation hall on Vareth Station was the kind of place that made you feel small on purpose. The ceiling was gone, or rather, it was so far up that clouds formed between the floor and whatever was above them. Actual clouds, thin and gray, and drifting through the light of the hall's internal atmosphere system. The table itself was a single piece of carved mineral from some planet, whose name my translation chip rendered as a sound like a stone dropping into still water. 46 chairs curved around it. Beautiful chairs. Species-specific, individually designed, each one a small announcement of belonging. And my stool. I want to be precise about this. The stool was not an accident. I had read 300 pages of council procedural history on the shuttle ride over, and I know, with the quiet certainty of someone who has spent 11 years in rooms where the furniture is a message, that nothing in a galactic council session happens without deliberate intention. The stool was a sentence. It said, "You are here to listen. You are here to receive. You are here because we permitted you to be here. And the permission has a shape, and the shape is a stool 8 inches behind the table." I wrote that down. The mediator opened the session at what the station's timekeeping system called 0900, though it meant nothing to my biology, which was running on 32 hours without proper sleep, and approximately 400 milliliters of a liquid the food replicator in my quarters had called coffee. It was not coffee. It was a warm brown gesture in the direction of coffee. I drank all of it and asked for more, and the replicator produced the same gesture again, and I drank that too. The mediator was a Varath. Long, pale, with a face structured around 3 horizontal slits that might have been eyes, or might have been something else entirely, and a voice that my chip translated into a sound like the careful turning of a very old key. It said, in the opening ceremonial language of the session, something that the chip rendered as, "We welcome our youngest members to the convocation." The Keth delegate laughed. There were 4 of them, the Keth, seated in chairs that looked like they had been grown rather than built, dense and dark and curved around them like cupped hands. They were tall when standing. Though seated, they folded in a way that made them appear compact, almost relaxed. Their laughter, when it came, was not a sound I would have identified as laughter without the chip telling me what it was. It was a high, rhythmic clicking from somewhere in their chest region, and it lasted about 3 seconds, and it was clearly a reference to something the rest of the room already understood. I did not know the joke. I looked it up later. It was apparently well known among council members, the formal welcome phrase used for humanity, which in context carried a secondary meaning closer to, "We welcome the children who have not yet learned to behave at the table." I wrote that down too. The Yaleth observer sat 2 seats to my right, if you counted the empty buffer space between its chair and where my stool had been placed, which I did. It had 4 eyes, each pair independent of the other, and 3 of the 4 were aimed at various points around the room, while the 4th was, occasionally, on me. Not watching, more like monitoring, the way you keep one eye on weather. My briefing document was 37 pages. I had read it 4 times. Page 1 carried the instruction that had been placed there by people whose names I was not authorized to share. People who sat in rooms on Earth whose windows looked out on weather and trees, and the particular gray light of a morning that smells like rain. People who had written those instructions with the full awareness that I would be reading them on a stool in a room with 46 other species, and one of them was already laughing. The instruction said, "Concede on points 1 through 9, hold point 10. I want to stop here and tell you what point 10 was. I cannot do that. Not because it is classified, though it is, but because there is no version of the explanation that does not make it sound smaller than it was, and it was not small. 11 years of decisions lived inside point 10. 11 years of resource allocation, of fleet construction, of quiet colonial expansion into systems the Council's charts marked as empty, of agricultural development on worlds the Council had not gotten around to naming yet, 11 years of building something while everyone in this room assumed we were simply waiting to be told what we were allowed to have. Point 10 was the word for all of that. The mediator read the opening framework of the draft accord. It was thorough. It was, in the specific language of interstellar diplomacy, generous. Humanity would receive formal recognition as a protected trading partner. Humanity would receive access to 3 standard shipping lanes currently restricted to full council members. Humanity would receive a tiered resource exchange arrangement, subject to annual review, subject to council approval, subject to a list of conditions that went on for 4 pages, and ended with a phrase the chip rendered as, pending continued cooperation, and demonstrated alignment with council interests. I read it all. I reached the section where point 10 should have been. It was not there. Not rejected. Not modified. Not countered. The section simply did not exist. The line spacing moved from the end of point 9 directly to the concluding language of the accord, smooth and unbroken, as if point 10 had never been raised, as if 11 years of humanity bringing it to every preliminary session had produced no mark at all on the document, as if we had been writing on water. I looked at my tablet. I looked at the stool I was sitting on. I looked at the door at the far end of the hall, past the table, and the 46 chairs, and the clouds drifting near the ceiling, and the Keth delegate who had laughed at the word youngest. I thought about something my first supervisor had told me, 10 years ago, in a small office in Geneva, that smelled like old paper and strong tea. He had said, "Mara, in any room where someone has decided in advance what you are allowed to want, the most dangerous thing you can do is want it anyway." I closed my tablet. I folded my hands on my knee. Outside the hall's viewport, Varath Station hung in orbit, around a gas giant so large that its rings caught the local star's light and scattered it into something that looked, from certain angles, very much like the sun, coming up over water. I had noticed it on the way in. I noticed it again now. I thought, 47 species in this room, 46 chairs, 1 stool, and not one of them has noticed that the math is wrong. Humanity had been negotiating. Past tense. The recess the mediator granted lasted 20 minutes by the station's counting, which translated to approximately 14 minutes by mine, which meant I had 14 minutes to eat the protein bar I had been carrying in my jacket pocket since the shuttle, and to read the message I had received from Earth approximately 6 hours earlier, and had not opened, because the timing, up until this moment, had not been right. I did not go to a private room. There were rooms available, small consultation spaces off the main corridor, but I had learned early that what you do in the spaces between sessions matters as much as what you say inside them, and I wanted to be seen eating a protein bar in a corridor and reading a tablet with the same expression I used when reading weather reports. The bar tasted like chalk and something attempting to be almond. I ate half of it and saved the other half for reasons I could not have explained. The message from Earth was flagged priority relay, which meant it had come through the military communication system rather than the diplomatic one, which meant someone with more authority than my direct supervisor had chosen to send it that way, which meant a number of things I allowed myself to think about only briefly before opening it. It was 4 words. I read them. I put the tablet in my jacket pocket. I finished the half of the protein bar I had been saving. It still tasted like chalk. The Keth delegate passed me in the corridor on the way back into the hall. It did not acknowledge me directly, but its translation collar was active, and I caught a fragment of what it was saying to its aide. Something about the session proceeding efficiently, something about the human representative having no meaningful leverage, something about the afternoon's agenda moving quickly now that the preliminary formality of the human response had been handled. It assumed I would sign. That was, I realized, the foundation of everything. The stool, the welcome to the youngest members, the removal of point 10 from the document without comment or explanation. All of it rested on a single load-bearing assumption, that we would sign, because the only alternative they had modeled was refusal, and refusal led to consequences they were confident we could not absorb, and so refusal was not, in their calculation, a real option. What they had not modeled was the third thing. I walked back into the hall. I sat on my stool. The mediator resumed the session with the same careful patience it had applied to everything, turning that old key in that old lock, reading the accord's concluding language, in a tone that suggested we were approaching a conclusion that had already been written. I waited until it reached the signature protocol section. Then I raised my hand. It was such a human gesture. I had been told, more than once, that hand-raising as a signal for attention read as aggressive or urgent to approximately 60% of council species. I had also been told that a junior human attaché speaking without being addressed first was a protocol irregularity that would be noted. I raised my hand. The mediator paused. 3 of its eye slits oriented toward me. I said, "I have a counter-proposal." There are sounds a room makes when something unexpected enters it. Not loud sounds. The opposite. A kind of collective breath-holding that each species performs in its own way. The Keth stilling their clicking. The Yalith observer's 4th eye swinging fully toward me. The mediator's key-turning voice stopping mid-rotation. I placed my single-page document on the table. I had to lean forward from the stool to do it, which meant for a moment I was balanced on the edge of the seat, with my arm extended, not dignified, not the posture of someone making a historical gesture. I did it anyway. The page sat on the table's carved surface. It looked very small. The page contained point 10, reinstated, expanded, and 7 additional points that had never appeared in any preliminary session, because we had not needed to show them until now. The Keth delegate looked at the page, then at me, then back at the page. The mediator said, still in that patient key-turning tone, that the draft accord was not a negotiating document. It said the session had reached the ratification stage. It said that humanity's role in this stage was to confirm acceptance of the framework that had been prepared with care, and with attention to all parties' foundational interests. I said, "I understand." Then I said, "We are declining." Silence is different in a room with 47 species in it. Human silence is just the absence of human sound, but this was the absence of 47 kinds of sound simultaneously, and it had a weight you could feel in the back of your teeth. The Keth delegate was the first to speak. It spoke for quite a long time. My chip translated efficiently and without editorializing, which I appreciated, because the editorializing I was doing internally was already considerable. The Keth delegate spoke about economic architecture, about the structure of interstellar trade and how certain species existed within that structure, and certain species existed because of that structure, and the distinction was important. It spoke about lane access and resource flow, and the historical outcomes for species that had, at moments of misplaced confidence, chosen to step outside the frameworks that kept interstellar civilization functioning. It mentioned the Dravasi. It did not say what happened to the Dravasi. It did not need to. Everyone in the room already knew. The Dravasi had a seat once, then they had a planet. Now they had neither, and the gap where their chair used to be had been filled so smoothly you would not have known it had ever existed unless you had read the old session records, which I had, because 32 hours without sleep is a good time to read things that make you want to sleep even less. I listened to all of it. I nodded at the relevant points. I thought about lunch. The food situation on Varath Station for human biology was genuinely difficult. The station's nutritional database had a human profile, but it was outdated by about 15 years, and based on dietary research that had apparently been conducted using a very small sample group from a single coastal region, so everything the replicators produced tasted of the sea in ways that were not always welcome. The protein bar was an improvement. I thought about the second half of it, which I had not saved after all, and felt the absence. The Keth delegate finished. It settled back in its grown chair and looked at me with the specific expression that translates across most species as, "We have concluded the part where we explain things to you, and you may now demonstrate that you have understood." I stood up. I gathered my materials, my tablet, my single-page counter-proposal, which the mediator had not touched, a pen I had brought from Earth out of habit, an actual ink pen, which had rolled twice during the session, and which I had retrieved with perhaps more urgency than the situation warranted. I said, "Thank you for the hall's excellent climate control." I picked up the stool. I want to be precise about this moment too, because I have been asked about it many times since, and the question is always some version of, why the stool? Why that specific gesture? What were you trying to say? I was not trying to say anything. I was tired. I had been in that room for 9 hours across 2 sessions, and I had slept 4 hours in the last 2 days, and the stool was in my hands before I had decided to pick it up. But the body knows things sometimes that the planning stages of the brain have not yet processed, and what the body did with that stool was walk it to the table and set it down in the gap between the Keth delegate's chair and the Yalith observer's chair, right in the space where a proper chair would have been if the math had been correct from the beginning. Nobody stopped me. I do not think they knew what to do with that. I am not sure I did either. I walked to the door. Behind me, I could hear the mediator beginning the emergency consultation protocol, its voice dropping into a register the chip rendered as urgent formal, a frequency change that meant the session was no longer proceeding according to its prepared structure. I could hear the Keth delegate clicking, not laughing this time, something else. Something the chip flagged as unclassified emotional response and left at that. The door of the hall was very large. It opened before I reached it, triggered by my motion, and the corridor beyond was long and lit in the pale gold that the station used for its public spaces. And somewhere down that corridor was the shuttle dock, and my ship, and the pilot from Christchurch, who was probably on his third energy drink by now, and wondering why the human attaché had not yet returned. I did not look back. Some sentences you write and leave on the table. You do not wait to see how they land. The shuttle dock smelled like engine coolant, and something metallic that I associated, for no clear reason, with morning. My pilot, whose name was Owen and who was 19 years old, and had the particular energy of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of the things that deserve fear, was sitting on the floor outside the docking tube, eating a nutrition pouch, and reading something on a flexible screen that he folded quickly when he saw me coming. I did not ask what he was reading. It was not relevant. He said, "Ma'am, you look like you had a time." I said, "Get the pre-launch checklist started." He got up, pocketed the nutrition pouch, and moved into the tube with the efficiency of someone who has been told on 3 separate occasions that the pre-launch checklist exists for reasons, and that those reasons do not disappear when you are in a hurry. I followed him in. I strapped into the co-pilot seat because it had a window, and I wanted a window for the next part. The next part began approximately 4 minutes after Owen completed the checklist, and the shuttle cleared the dock. Vereth Station sits in a wide orbital band around the gas giant, far enough from the ring plane that the view from the shuttle, once we cleared the station's bulk, was the planet below, and the rings cutting across the middle distance and, above and around and in, every direction that mattered, empty space. It was not empty anymore. They came out of the dark in formation, 300 vessels, and I know the word formation implies something martial, something aggressive, ships arranged for conflict, but this formation was something else. It was structured the way a city is structured, the way an answer is structured, each ship in a position that referenced every other ship and together made a shape that said, "We know where we are, we know why we are here, and we are not here because we were permitted. We are here because we came." Transport ships, colony ships, freighters with holds big enough to carry the material for an entire settlement, agricultural platforms, long and flat and green even through the viewport, their growing systems active, crops moving in the recycled air in a way that looked, at this distance, like breathing. Supply chain vessels, the unglamorous ones, the ones that make every other kind of ship possible, the ones that carry the parts and the fuel and the processed materials, and the 1,000 other things that the glamorous ships need to exist. No warships. I want to be very clear about this because the Council's intelligence reports from that day describe what happened as a military action, and it was not a military action. It was a demonstration, but not of force. It was a demonstration of something that has no clean name in any language I have access to, something between capability and intention, and the simple statement of a fact that had been quietly true for 11 years, without anyone outside humanity knowing it. The fact was this: we could leave. Not retreat, not withdrawal under pressure. Leave. Sustained, self-sufficient, independent departure from the Council's economic and political architecture, with enough infrastructure to not come back until we chose to. The fleet in orbit around Vereth Station was not a threat aimed at the Council. It was proof aimed at ourselves, confirmation of something we had built toward through 11 years of careful construction, while every Council intelligence assessment described us as resource-dependent, strategically limited, unlikely to be a significant independent actor within the next 3 to 5 decades. The assessments were wrong. They were wrong because they were looking at what we had and not at what we were building. They were wrong because the model of humanity they were working from was a model of humanity as we had been when we first walked into the convocation hall, not as we were now, not as we had become in the years of quiet work that looked, from the outside, like nothing. Owen said, very quietly, "There they are." I said nothing. I was watching the agricultural platform 200 meters to our left, the way the light from the gas giant caught its growing bays and turned them warm gold, the color of a field in late afternoon, on a planet very far from here. The communication system activated. The station was calling. Not the mediator's official channel. The emergency diplomatic frequency, which is reserved for situations that have moved past the reach of standard session protocol. The chip translated the incoming signal flag as urgent critical, which was a category I had not seen used in 11 years of working with this system. I let it come through. The mediator's voice. That same key turning patience, but under different pressure now, turning faster, turning harder, the mechanism under strain. It said, "The Council requests that the human mission return to the hall for continued dialogue." I had a prepared response. I had written it during the shuttle ride out, before the session, in the margins of my briefing document where I had been told to concede on points 1 through 9 and hold point 10. The prepared response was 3 sentences. Formal, calibrated, the diplomatic equivalent of a door left slightly open. I did not use it. I said, "We are departing. Thank you for the climate control." Then I closed the channel. Owen turned his head toward me, with an expression I recognized as the face of someone experiencing an event they have been intellectually prepared for, but emotionally surprised by. He had been briefed. He knew the outline. The knowing and the watching it happen are different things, and his face showed the distance between them. I said, "Plot the rendezvous coordinates." He turned back to the controls. His hands on the system were steady, I noticed. 19 years old, 300 ships in the dark outside the viewport, 47 species on the station behind us, probably already in emergency session, and his hands were steady. I noted that. I thought it was worth noting. The communication system activated again. Different channel this time. Not the emergency diplomatic frequency. Something more specific. The Yaleth Observer's personal diplomatic identifier, routed through the station's civilian system, as if to emphasize that this was not an official communication, that it was personal, one individual to another, a conversation, rather than a negotiation. 312 words. My chip counted them. I remember this because I counted them too, twice, reading the message, and counted differently both times. And the discrepancy bothered me enough that I focused on it as a way of not focusing on what the words actually said. The Yaleth Observer wrote, "I do not understand what you are doing. I do not say this as criticism. I say it as fact. The models we apply to human behavior have not produced this outcome in any simulation we have run. You are not behaving according to the architecture of your position. Your position does not support this action. Your resource dependencies are documented. Your fleet capacity, as of the last assessment, does not permit sustained independent operation. I am telling you this, not to make a threat, but because I genuinely believe there has been a miscalculation, and I would personally prefer, not to see it produce a bad outcome for your species. The Council can revisit the framework. Point 10 can be included. There is room for this. Please respond." I read it twice. I counted the words twice. Then I thought about the last line. Please respond. The word please. In 11 years of Council communications, I had not seen that word in an official transmission. I was not certain I had seen it in an unofficial one either. I wrote back, "Thank you for writing. We are departing." Owen said, without looking up, "Signal from the fleet. They are ready for the jump sequence on your word." I looked out the viewport. The fleet was arranged in departure formation now, which is different from the formation they had held in orbit. Less city and more sentence. Each ship oriented toward the same point in the dark. 300 vessels carrying 11 years of work toward a destination the Council's charts called empty. It was not empty. I said, "Tell them we are ready." The communication system activated a third time. Different channel again. Not the Yaleth Observer. Not the mediator. The Keth delegate. No translation flag. Meaning the message had been sent in direct language. Not through official Council channels. Meaning it was not on record. Meaning what I was about to hear had not been said officially, and therefore could be officially denied. The Keth delegate did not use the chip's formal voice. It spoke in something the chip rendered with hesitation, labeling several phrases as emotionally ambiguous, or culturally complex, before settling on translations it marked as approximate. The message was short. It said, "You cannot maintain this. Your supply infrastructure has limits we have measured. Your colonial range has limits we have assessed. You will need the Council's trade architecture within 18 months. We are willing to wait. We are telling you this so that when you return, as you will return, it is not necessary for either of us to pretend this departure was more than it was." I thought about the 18 months estimate. I thought about the intelligence assessments that had produced it. I thought about how assessments are built, which is to say, From what you can see, what was visible, what had been allowed to be visible. I did not respond to the Keth delegate. I turned to Owen and said, "Execute the jump sequence." He said, "Yes, ma'am." Then he said, very quietly, to himself or to the ship or to nobody, "Here we go." The fleet jumped. The gas giant and its rings and Verath station with its 46 chairs and its one stool, and its clouds drifting near a ceiling I had never actually seen, simply stopped being in front of us. Space does not close dramatically when you leave it. It just stops containing the thing that was there. One moment, the station, the fleet, the light on the rings, then, coordinates, and the dark, and the particular silence of somewhere new. I took the other half of the protein bar from my jacket pocket and discovered I had in fact eaten it already. At some earlier point in the session I had not tracked, and I sat with the empty wrapper in my hand for a moment, looking at the coordinates on the navigation display, before I put it in the waste receptacle beside my seat. Owen said, "Journey time to rendezvous approximately 9 hours. I said, "Wake me at 7. Then I closed my eyes, in the co-pilot chair of a shuttle at the edge of somewhere the council had never thought to look, and I slept better than I had slept in 11 years. 9 hours became 11 because the rendezvous point had been moved twice since the jump coordinates were filed, which was standard security protocol, and then moved a third time because of a debris field on the original approach vector that someone had neglected to map, which was not standard, and produced a 14-minute argument over the communications relay that I slept through entirely and heard about afterward. The station, when we reached it, did not look like what you would build if you wanted to impress someone. It looked like what you build when you need something to work. There were no grand halls, no architecture designed to communicate significance through scale. There were modules, roughly 30 of them at that point, connected by transit tubes and docking collars, and in 2 places by simple pressurized walkways that had been described in the construction plan as temporary, and were now, 8 months later, clearly permanent. Exposed wiring ran along the outside of 3 modules that had been expanded faster than the cable management could keep up with. One of the docking arrays was installed at a 7-degree angle from spec, because the team had hit a structural issue with the original mount point and made a decision in the field. It was the most functional place I had ever entered. There were 42 people on the station at the time of my arrival. I know this because I counted them over the first 3 days, not all at once but cumulatively, and the number surprised me. 42 people, in the darkness between star systems that the Council's charts had marked as transit space, building something. I had my own space, small, with a viewport that looked out at the fleet, which had taken up station-keeping positions in a pattern that was defensive without being aggressive, the same distinction the formation outside Verath had carried. My desk was a flat surface bolted to the wall. Someone had put a light above it that was warmer than the station's standard overhead lighting, and I did not know who had done that, but I appreciated it in a way I found difficult to articulate. The chair was from Earth. Actual wood, actual fabric, carried here across interstellar distance in the hold of a freighter that also contained hydroponic equipment and soil samples, and 3,000 meters of structural cable. Someone had thought to bring a chair. I thought about that for a while. The debrief began the day after I arrived, and ran for 3 days, and produced a document I was told was going to be classified at a level that required a separate clearance category to be created for it, which I chose to interpret as a compliment. On the morning of the 4th day, the first council message arrived. Formal, on the record, official diplomatic frequency, the seal of the mediator's office at the top, followed by the standard language of a council communique, which is to say, long, careful, layered with the kind of politeness that carries its opposite inside it, the way certain fruits carry their seeds. Humanity was invited to return to the convocation for resumed dialogue. The council recognized that the previous session had ended, before full discussion had occurred. The council remained committed to a framework that served all parties' foundational interests. The council looked forward to continued engagement. I filed it, under the letter G. I had a filing system. It had been with me for 11 years, and it was entirely personal, and it was not, I should say, an official system recognized by the diplomatic service, which used an alphanumeric code structure that I respected professionally and found emotionally inert. My personal system used single letters. G was for things that could wait without consequence. A was for things that needed a response that day. And at the bottom of the drawer, in a folder I had carried since my first posting, a folder whose label I had written in my own handwriting, with the ink pen that now lived in my jacket pocket. The folder marked R, for things I was keeping as records of who was in the room and what they chose to say and when. The Keth delegate's message from the shuttle went into folder R. The second council communique arrived 6 days later, shorter. The formality was present but less layered, the politeness carrying less of its opposite. The word framework appeared twice instead of 6 times. There was a line that had not appeared in the first message. The council acknowledges that certain procedural aspects of the previous session may not have fully reflected the collaborative spirit the convocation seeks to embody. I read that sentence 4 times. May not have fully reflected. The gap between what that sentence said and what it meant was large enough to park a fleet in. I filed it under G. The third message arrived 4 days after that. Same day as a supply delivery from one of the freighters, which meant I was in the docking bay when the message came in and read it on my tablet standing next to 4 crates of hydroponic nutrients and 1 crate that someone had labeled as equipment, but which, when I looked at it, had the stenciled word coffee in small letters near the bottom, and I want to be honest that this discovery affected my capacity for objective analysis of the communique to a modest but measurable degree. The third message contained a direct reference to the supply chain situation that had developed among 3 council species in the weeks since humanity's departure. The reference was framed as background context, as relevant information that the human mission might find useful in assessing the current interstellar trade environment. It was not, officially, a statement of consequence. It was a sentence, arranged in the shape of a statement of consequence, and a sentence can do a great deal of work simply through its arrangement. I filed it under G. Then I went to find whoever had labeled that crate. The person responsible turned out to be a structural engineer named Helen, who was 44 years old and had come to the station from a long-term posting on an orbital agricultural platform, and who had, apparently, spent her entire professional career in environments where the coffee situation was unacceptable, and had developed a philosophy about this that she was willing to explain in considerable detail. I let her explain it. I drank a cup of the coffee, which was real, and which tasted like something that had taken a long time and significant distance to get here, which made it, objectively, the best cup of coffee I had ever had. Helen said, "How bad was it, the session?" I said, "They had a stool instead of a chair." She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "One of the habitat modules has an extra chair in storage. Bolt it to your floor before the partial gravity system starts making things migrate. Things migrate in partial gravity." I said I would. I had the chair bolted down that afternoon, the same chair that was now behind my desk, under the warm light someone had installed, looking out at the viewport that showed the fleet. The fourth council message came from a channel I had not seen before, not the mediator's office, the Keth delegate, via a sub-channel of the standard council diplomatic relay, in a way that was technically on the official record, but flagged in a subcategory that meant it would not appear in the standard digest, which meant it was meant to be seen but not widely. The Keth delegate said, "We may have underestimated certain aspects of the human mission's operational parameters." That was the whole message. I stared at it for quite a long time. Then I put it in folder R, which had never been intended as a folder for anything this significant, but which was where it belonged. The fifth message was from the Yaleth Observer, personal channel again, long again, but different in tone from the message on the shuttle, which had been urgent and slightly desperate in the way that the word please had signaled. This message was something else, slower, more considered. The Yaleth Observer wrote about the history of the council, about the species that had joined early, and the species that had joined late, and the different ways joining had looked across 300 years of the council's existence. It wrote about a species called the Manath, who had built their own infrastructure before joining, and about how the terms of the Manath's entry had been different from the terms offered to everyone who joined without that infrastructure. It did not say why it was writing about the Manath. It did not need to. I wrote back, "Thank you for the history. It is interesting." The Yaleth Observer responded within an hour. "I thought you might find it so." I put that exchange in a new folder. I did not have a letter for it yet. I left it unlabeled and went to the communal meal that happened every evening in the station's largest connected module, which was still not very large, and sat between Helen and a navigation specialist named Patrick, who had a habit of drawing orbital mechanics diagrams on whatever flat surface was available, and who had covered approximately 60% of the communal table in calculations over the past week. I said, "Patrick." He said, "Sorry, I know. I'll get a proper pad." He said this every evening. He did not get a proper pad. I found I did not mind. After the meal, I went back to my desk and sat in the bolted-down earth chair under the warm light and looked at the viewport and the fleet beyond it, and I thought about 11 years, which is a long time to build something in secret, and also not a long time at all, depending on what you are building toward. The sixth council message arrived 3 weeks after the fifth. It was from the mediator directly. Not the mediator's office, the mediator. It was long, and it was careful, and the tone of it was something I had no precise word for. Not quite respect, not quite fear. Something in the space between those two things. Something that had not existed in the mediator's voice during the session in the hall, with the stool, and the clouds near the ceiling. Something new. The mediator said that humanity was invited to return to the convocation as full members. A chair at the table, not the accommodations of a junior observer. A chair. Point 10, and the 7 additional points I had placed on the table, were open for discussion. The council was prepared to begin from the counterproposal, rather than the original draft accord. It said, "We invite you to come home." I read that phrase 3 times. Come home. I thought about what home meant in this message. The convocation hall on Vareth Station, with its 46 chairs and its clouds and its Keth delegate, and its welcome to the youngest members. The architecture that had spent 11 years telling us what we were allowed to want. The table I had placed a stool against and walked away from. That was not home. I looked at the viewport, the fleet, the dark between stars that was not empty, because we had put something in it. The station with its exposed wiring and its angled docking array, and Helen's coffee philosophy, and Patrick's table covered in orbital diagrams and 42 people building a thing that did not have a name yet, because we had not gotten around to naming it, because there was still too much to build. I started writing the reply. It took 40 minutes to write 3 sentences. I almost signed it with my name. Then I did not. I signed it. Human Diplomatic Mission. Unratified. Because the station's 4th module still had open panels where the atmospheric system had not been fully sealed. Because the star outside our viewport had a number in our records and no name. Because the coffee was real but the supply of it was limited, and Helen was already planning the 2nd shipment. Because there was a folder on my desk with no letter on it, and I did not know what letter it deserved yet. Because some things you sign when you know what you are signing, and some things you wait. I pinned the mediator's message to the wall above my desk. Not as a record of winning something. I do not think of what happened at Vareth as winning, because winning implies that the contest was the point, and the contest was never the point. We were not in that hall to defeat anyone. We were there to stop being the species that sat on a stool 8 inches behind the table, while other species laughed and pointed at the gap in the accord, where our interests should have been. The message on the wall was a reminder, not of the stool, not of the Keth delegates' laughter, or the Dravasi's empty chair, or the 11 years of quiet work that the council had never thought to measure. Those things I could remember without a reminder. The message was a reminder of one thing only. One thing that 11 years of diplomacy, of reading session records and briefing documents and intelligence assessments and messages from people in rooms on Earth whose windows looked out on rain, had taken 11 years to teach me completely. The most dangerous thing you can do in any negotiation is not threaten. It is not bluff. It is not even walk away. It is make them watch you build something without them. Then make them wonder what you are building. Then do not tell them. Not yet.